Hi, I'm Tova, Wellspring president and co-founder, and I'm thrilled to do the show today that's going to be about perspective and self-regulation. It's primarily a parenting show on how to train our kids to regulate themselves and have perspective. But really, this show applies to everybody because we all need to do this to be healthy people. It is a building block to healthy life. And with me on the show, I have two great therapists. I have Salima Harris. Hi, Salima. And I also have Kaara Kiddoe. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, not just as a therapist, but as a parent, because the show is for parenting. So Salima, tell us a little about yourself.
Hi, Tova. I am Salima Harris, the student intern at Wellspring. I am a military wife. I've been married for 12 years, and I have 3 children, ages 17, 13, and 7. My 2 oldest are girls, and my youngest is a boy.
All right. So you've got a few years of experience under your belt on this. That's great.
A few.
A few. And how about you, Kaara?
Hi. Glad to be here, Tova. I have been with Wellspring since 2016, and I really enjoy working with couples and individuals who have experienced trauma. I myself have 2 kids, a 6-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy. And so I'm excited that we're doing this podcast today on parenting. Much needed.
It is much needed. So I'm Tova. I don't want to tell you quite how old my kids are, but my older ones are in their 30s. I have 2, a boy and a girl. And then my youngest is in college. And so we're empty nesters, and it's a wonderful life stage. Something to look forward to, all you parents out there. No, it's great to have adult children too, and they still are actively engaged. So this is about perspective in our children and how to help our kids have perspective to regulate themselves in order to see what's really happening and not get so lost in a moment that they can't see the world around them for what's really happening in the present. So stick with the show. We're going to dive right in. We're going to talk about boys and girls and some of the differences between them on how to train this and practical things on how to train it. And this will apply again to everybody, but especially specifically to our kids. So part 1, let me just dive in. The first question I want to ask, and Salima is going to primarily lead this show for us, but is what is perspective as it relates to parenting and to children?
That is a great question, Tova. Perspective in general is just our point of view, right? But according to Chapter 2, perspective is being aware of what we're thinking and what we're feeling, and having the ability to rate the intensity of our feelings. And so what makes up perspective is the ability to regulate our emotions, to research the situation, and to respond accordingly. So that's what makes up perspective.
Okay, so I want to make a little comment here for our audience. She said Chapter 2. So let me tell you, that is Chapter 2 of the book, How to Track, Are My Kids on Track? It's by Dr. Sissy Goff and a few others. And we are running a group on this, ongoing support groups for parents using this curriculum. And this is Chapter 2, one of the emotional milestones. But regardless of the book, it's still what perspective is. So my next question is, well, how can parents gain a better perspective?
Well, first, when we don't have perspective, we're usually emotionally flooded. And what that means is that we're just completely overwhelmed with emotions. And when that happens, we're unable to think clearly. And then we may react impulsively or in ways that may be counterintuitive to the situation. And so when we're thinking about that, both children and adults have the capacity to be flooded and respond inappropriately.
So,
and
Kaara,
so
do you have...
what happens? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So having perspective just allows us to be the best versions of ourselves. And it also decreases the likelihood that we'll make the situation worse, you know?
It's really true. So, Kaara, I didn't know if you wanted to comment on perspective, just so we all really get it. It's that sense that you can only see it from a very narrow point of view because you're flooded with emotions. You're not seeing things clearly. You can't see things from other people's perspectives or a different perspective because you're so overly engaged. That's kind of how I would say it. How would you say it, Kaara?
I really appreciate this definition of perspective with the idea and ability that it is both kind of being able to take a giant step back, but paying attention to what it is that is going on internally with us so that we can even have a broader view of what is happening. We have to be aware not only of what we're thinking, but what we're feeling and where we're feeling it in our body. And that really is going to help us to be more aware. But we can't do that unless we are intentional about it and we're actually pressing pause, taking a moment, taking a deep breath, slowing down our thoughts and our brains and our bodies, enough so that we could really just realize what is going on internally.
Yeah, I think of it, I when I get it right, I have begun to experience like kind of an objective view of myself at the same time, being in my body and out of my body at the same time. I don't know if you guys feel it that way, but it's kind of like why my voice is heightened and I'm talking faster and I'm thinking at the same time, wow, you're really upset about this.
Yes.
And look at how they're responding to the fact that you're kind of yelling, And so it's a little of the inside and the outside at the same time. So let's get going and let's talk about kids for a minute here, Salima. Tell us, what are the notable differences for girls and boys as they develop perspective and as we train them to do
that? Okay, so I'd like to start with what they have in common. Okay. And so just kids in general, when it comes to perspective, kids tend to rate every event or bad thing that they're experiencing as a 10. So, for example, the book talks about not being able to get a candy bar, and that's like a 10. And then they rate it the same as being betrayed by a friend. So as a 10. So they tend to rate bad things the same way. So it feels like they're, just maybe overreacting when it comes to bad things. But that's generally how kids respond to bad things.
Well, and you can picture that from infancy. So they're hungry, they scream. They're cold, they scream, right? And so it's something that you actually grow out of as a kid. But it certainly is what is normal, is what you're saying, for all kids to
absolutely
to do it that way, see it as severe.
Right? Absolutely. Yep. And another similarity that girls and boys both have is sometimes they tend to lack the coping skills that are necessary to deal with their emotions. So kids nowadays, when we think about generations past, seem to be a little bit more sensitive and less resilient to emotional distress. So that is what they do have in common.
Okay. So it seems like things are it's a little harder for kids now to do that. Maybe we just, as parents, are not training them enough with it, maybe, or low frustration tolerances.
Yeah. So. And honestly, kids are dealing with a lot. They're dealing with, this world of technology, and just everything just seems to be, exacerbated. So yeah, things just in general look really different. I mean, we're in this COVID season where they had to go to school online all day. That is a traumatic experience. So just in general, they are less, I guess, able to handle their emotions, but they're also dealing with a lot too. So I don't want to ignore that.
No, that's important. The overload of instant information and instant everything makes them they don't have a slower life where they have time to regulate because things are too fast. So, all right, well, let's talk about the boys and the girls and just tell us what we can learn here.
Okay, so when it comes to boys in perspective, it's really important to understand that boys just learn differently than girls. And so boys are typically visual learners, they're kinetic learners, they're spatial learners, and they're experiential learners. And one thing they are not are auditory learners. And so what adults tend to do is maybe lecture. So not just parents, maybe teachers, neighbors, loved ones, church leaders, we tend to talk, and boys just don't necessarily respond to that. So boys tend to learn best through going through the motions. And so again, lecturing doesn't necessarily help. And so to help boys gain perspective, it's better that they have experiences and seeing things firsthand. And so what's recommended is that they may participate in maybe a service project, because they can see what's really going on and they can experience it and feel it that way. And that's how boys tend to gain perspective. So that's boys, but with girls, perspective tends to look different. And really what that means is that it feels different for girls because they have their own, unique struggles with perspective. And I'm generalizing, so not every girl and not every boy is the same, but girls they tend to be better at self-regulation. However, it is important for us to understand as parents, as loved ones, people who care for children, it's important to know the difference between self-regulation and self-control and even concealment of emotions. And so girls are better at hiding how they really feel. And so that doesn't mean they're regulating themselves. Self-regulation means that they are able to process and they understand their emotions. But when they're concealing it, they may be avoiding it, they may be stuffing, and they just may be able to wear a mask and not really show how they feel. But what's happening is that when we stuff our feelings in general, not just kids, even adults, those feelings tend to just get worse and worse and worse if we don't actually process it. So it's really important to just know that difference. And that's the struggle that sometimes girls experience with perspective.
Yeah, and let's just highlight very quickly here your caveat that this is not all boys or all girls. And they're generally very, very true. I have 2 grandchildren too, and one of them is all girl, the traditional, like it's not taught, it's just who she is, and he's all boy, everything's a stick or a gun or it's just who he is, and he's very exactly what you just described, and struggles to regulate himself because he just has to use his whole body and everything. So anyway, thank you let's remember that we have girls who function more like boys and boys who function more like girls. And the point is to know our own kids, the kids we're working with, and what is their learning style and what is their ability. So I think on that point, we're going to take a very short break and then we will be right back. Hi, welcome back to Wellspring on the Air. This is Tova, president and co-founder of Wellspring, and we're glad you're with us today on this show. If you've just joined us, then you can find us on Wellspring on the Air, your favorite podcast channel, and you can go back. The name of this show is Perspective and Self-Regulation, Emotional Building Blocks. So listen to the beginning if you missed it. We're glad you're joining us. So far, what we've talked about is a little bit of what is perspective and the ability to stay self-regulated and see what's going on inside yourself and in others and kind of keep a clear sense of perspective of a reality around you. And then we talked about a little bit of the differences between and similarities of girls and boys. So this next section, we're going to talk about what are the stumbling blocks and the building blocks for helping our children to gain perspective. So Salima, if you will just jump right back in, that would be great. So why don't you talk to us about the stumbling blocks?
Okay, I'll start with boys. So there are 3 stumbling blocks for boys and girls. And for boys, it's intervening, discipline, and coddling. And so to talk a little bit about intervening, what we tend to do as adults or parents is to step in and fix problematic behavior. And so we do that because it's hard to watch our kids struggle. And so what a practical idea is, instead of intervening, because that is a stumbling block, they recommend offering support. And that looks like just observing, waiting, being curious with them, and responding with validation. And so when we do that, it communicates that we actually think that they're capable of, regulating their emotions, and that they're actually have the competency to fix the situations on their own. And when we do fix it, we're actually communicating the opposite. And so there are times when we do have to give instructions, but if the situation presents itself, it's better to offer support.
All right, Kaara, can you give a very short example of that? Otherwise, I got one with my grandson that pops right to mind.
Well, I was thinking about just the idea that those of us who may have had like very difficult childhood growing up, there is this tendency to want to not have your children experience what you experience, right? Mm-hmm. But in a lot of ways, those difficult things that we overcame really built character and made us stronger, and is, part of who we are today. And so sometimes when we protect our kids from or prevent them from the struggle, we are, inadvertently, not helping them to build their character and strengthen that little tenacity muscle to push through for certain things. So our kids end up giving up a little bit easier than they should, and maybe part of it might be our impatience, right? Like my daughter is learning to read, and she's constantly asking me, what is B-A, and before she even finishes, I'm like, okay, I'm telling her what the word is, instead of just letting her sound it out and take forever to do it, but me helping her isn't helping her in that sense.
Our impatience is a major reason we intervene, because for them to self-regulate and work it through, we may have to let them cry or scream for a length of time, and that's very hard to listen to. Right. We don't want to have to hear it, and we just want them to fix it or go away, versus, to say to them something like, as soon as you're done crying, come back in and play the game with us. But if it's 25 minutes of that crying, we want to step in and fix it some other way. And so us tolerating their suffering is very challenging. All right, we have to keep moving on. So you had intervening, discipline, and coddling as stumbling blocks for boys. So talk to us about discipline.
Okay, really quickly, with discipline, it's important here to make sure that we're offering appropriate consequences to the actual event. So what we don't want to do is give the same consequence for varying levels of, misbehavior. So if someone, maybe a young person, forgot to wash the dishes, we don't want to do the same thing that we do if they skip school, right? So a lot of times we want to take a cell phone for everything, but that's not helping them to develop perspective, as everything just seems to be having the same kind of consequence. So it's really important to also make sure that we, like you said, Kaara, are doing our best to regulate and make sure that we're not dumping as well. So that's really important. And with coddling, discipline, sometimes we're responding out of frustration and anger. But with coddling, we could also be operating out of guilt and fear. And particularly with boys, it's really important to look at, and just in general, parent-child relationships. Because what happens is, especially with mother and son, that's just a different relationship. It's really important to look at those, because if they are unhealthy, and just going back to mother and son, what tends to happen is because we don't want our sons to have that meltdown or just have that explosive behavior, we may tend to put more on our girls and have this expectancy that they become independent. And while the boys are more coddled and they don't have responsibility. And the bad thing with that is, or the harm in that, is that it really limits boys' development and their into becoming a responsible adult. And it also prevents them the opportunity to work through their emotions because we're operating out of this fear. I don't want my son to explode. I don't want to deal with this behavior. So I'm just not, I'm going to coddle, so that is a stumbling block to gaining perspective with boys.
They don't learn to because it gets fixed very quickly because their responses are more physical and bigger. And the girls may go internal, like you said earlier. So, all right, well, what are those stumbling blocks for the girls?
Okay, so the stumbling blocks for girls are dramatization of drama, family noise, and a lower threshold. So again, this is a tendency, but not for all girls. Girls tend to be a little bit dramatic, and so they the expression of their emotions tend to be more intense. But what girls are doing is they're searching for ways to define themselves. And what they also desire is to be seen, heard, and loved. And so when they are maybe acting out, it's because of that. So that's one stumbling block, just because the expression of their emotions are bigger. And family noise is another stumbling block. And what family noise is it can be internal or external stressors or factors that prevent girls from being seen, heard, and loved. And so there are several examples. If there's a family who has a child with special needs, if there's parental discord, maybe divorce or financial stressors, even times where parents are concerned that their daughter is too sad, and so we want to do things to keep them busy. Various different scenarios. But the thing is that it's just all this extra stuff that's going on where the girls just don't feel heard. And so what they may do in response is shout. Like, oh, I'm trying to express in a lower way, but no one's hearing me. So I may shout, girls may scream. They may even lie to get the attention that they're actually craving. And, one thing to remember here is that parents, and adults really try their best. They believe they're doing what's right, and they're doing what they know. And so this isn't, something where we're like dumping on parents or anything like that. But it's just really important to know that parents are doing their best, but just to notice what's going on so that we can respond appropriately. And so a practical idea with this is psychiatrist Daniel Siegel's idea of attunement. And so that means we just listen to all of our kids. And this isn't just for girls. We make time to connect, to hear, and to see them. And so what we may have to do in our busy lives is slow down and be curious about their feelings.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Well, you have talked about these stumbling blocks and you're already moving into solutions. But as we begin to wrap up, we've got a couple minutes left. But talk a little bit more about some of the solutions. What are the building blocks that we can put in there that are going to help our kids develop self-regulation and perspective?
Okay, so with boys, there are 3 building blocks. And so with boys, it's space, it's practice, and it's cues. And so because boys experience emotions physically, they need a space to kind of let out that emotion that they have. And so helping them to channel the emotions that they have constructively helps them to not only decrease the likelihood that they may hurt themselves or others if they are actually channeling their energy more constructively. And so with this, it's recommended that.
I was going to say, this is sort of like me making sure my husband gets a chance to exercise before I ask him about his day. Right? I mean, very practically.
Absolutely.
It's the space to do some physical things or to work off those strong feelings and to get regulated before we add new information on. So I think that's very practical. So what next?
Yeah, and just it's important to practice this. And so we want to give options that involve movement. And so we practice that. So if it's jumping on a trampoline or running upstairs, we want to make sure that they're practicing it and that we're also modeling it, because we can't expect our kids to do what we aren't willing to do. Understand that it's trial and error. We have to figure out what works best for them. Cues is the last building block for boys. And so creating verbal and nonverbal cues to help them understand that their emotions are rising. And it's just a signal for them to be proactive. And it helps them to build perspective by just being aware of their emotions and going to that space and processing it. And so with girls, the 3 building blocks is a scale that we discussed earlier, creating a scale. They call it the dramamometer. And the next one is time and skills to cope with time. So just allowing ourselves time to sit with the difficult emotions. Because if we don't make time to sit with it, how can we cope with it, right? And so the last, and with the time, they create a yellow light system. And the yellow light system is much like cues for boys. So it's just really providing that opportunity to notice when emotions are rising and making a judgment to intervene. And so the last one for girls is consequences. So the yellow light is a warning. And if girls or kids in general are not heeding to those warnings, consequences are necessary. And so if we don't implement consequences, they won't disappear. The behavior won't disappear with time. So they need to know that, it's important to stop the behavior. And so what we do as adults is try to figure out what helps to stop that behavior.
So I think your consequences are good, but if we don't do the first part, which is give them opportunities to really talk in a calm way, to regulate themselves, to calm down, to pull themselves down, and we warn them and we cue them, you need to tone it down, and they begin to regulate, then we can consequence them. But we don't consequence them for feeling strongly. We consequence them for not coming at it in a good way. And then we need to reward them too when they've actually mastered it. Man, you calmed yourself down and talked so respectfully in this process, and tell me how you felt and all of that. So we give them those opportunities. Well, we are at the end of our time. You've done such a great job. I can tell there's just so much more here that we would want to cover. And I have a little list in front of me of practical things and apologizing and reflecting back and journaling and reading the Psalms and some of these things. And I just want to end on that last biblical note, which is that this concept is very consistent with all of Scripture, that we don't let the sun go down on our anger. That's self-regulating. I'm going to do something about it, And when we're upset with people, we go directly to them before we go to the Lord. And so learning to do those things, to be respectful of adults, to fear, to manage our fear and our anxiety, and to bring all those things to God. So there's a lot of Scripture that validates that. We do need to wrap up. And so we thank you all for joining our show today. And again, if you join mid-program, midstream, you can find us on your favorite podcast channel, Wellspring on the Air. You can also find our blogs on wellspringmiami.org, and encourage people to listen to us. And we're glad you did. And we're here for you if you need us. So it's time to wrap up. This is Tova and Kaara and Salima with Wellspring on the Air, because hearts and minds matter.